This wonderful depiction of the coast from Chiddock to Lyme Regis, painted in 1539, allows us to see how the area looked at that time. Queen Elizabeth I was to reign from 1558 until 1603, and it's this period I will try to cover in my researches into Charmouth and the surrounding area. The view depicts the church in the centre, surrounded by a number of cottages. The beacons on the hills above the village were for early warning of invasion. It's strange to think that when we walk along the street to go to one of the shops, they are following a path their ancestors trod nearly 500 years ago. My talk is based on an amazing survey taken in 1564, 6 years into the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, that I came across in the Devon Record Office. For a long time I could not do much with it until contacting Stephen Hobbs, who had earlier translated and published the Ford Abbey cartulary and was an expert on these early surveys. It's a wonderful record of the village after its nearly 300 years of possession by Ford Abbey and its transition to ownership by the wealthy Sir William Petre, who was Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth in that year. There are 15 pages of the document shown here, each of which is beautifully written. I've attempted to make sense of the mass of information that comes from the translation of the survey and listed the main facts in a chart shown here. It's based on the size of the land holdings from the smallest to the largest. The original burgage plots were half an acre. This was not found sufficient to support a family, and by 1564 they'd been amalgamated into an acre, often with an additional acre of land, which was the area south of the street to the sea. The total acreage comes to 348 acres, which compares to 546 acres today. The difference can be explained by John Hall, the surveyor, not including some common land, woods and lands owned by the rector, which are worth £13 a year. It goes on to describe that the parson's living rises very much on tithe fish. There is a stay or resting place for boats at the mouth of the river Char, and 9 fisher boats belong to the same. Newlands, which at that time was part of the village, had a total of 126 acres. This was rented by Joan Tibbs. She was the widow of Ralph Tibbs, who had formerly been the steward for the village and had lived in what is today the Abbotts house, built for him by his uncle, Thomas Chard, the last abbot of Ford. A number of the names shown in the list are familiar to us today in a different form. Examples of this is Foxley Acre, Lily Mead, Wesley, The Grange, Roadhorn and Newlands. The full translation of the 1564 survey can be seen on the Freshford website. The total rent was £27 at that time. This survey is preserved in a thick volume shown here of all the many estates Sir William Petre had accumulated. They cover many counties, including Devon, where it had over 36,000 acres, including the town of Axminster. I split the talk into 2 parts, again based on the survey, as the last page contains a description of the village's boundary. It describes the neighbouring estates and its owners in that year. This has been a revelation to me, and after tremendous research, I've been able to pinpoint where they were situated and who owned them at that time. Returning back to the 1564 survey, I will now attempt to analyse it and come up with some conclusions during this talk. But first I want to look at the early history of Charmouth leading up to its sale by Queen Elizabeth I. Again, we are fortunate that Stephen Hobbs was able to translate the cartulary for Ford Abbey, still held by the Roper family there today, whose first 72 entries refer to Charmouth and Newlands and are full of information relating to them. Most important of these is in 1300, when the abbot transformed the village into a borough. Each villager would have a burgage plot of half-acre on either side of the street, stretching back to a bank in the south and high wall in the north. There are still vestiges of these today to be seen after 700 years. The boundary wall has stood up well and has only been pierced in a few places since then. This slide shows the wall today and the section along Bars Lane. This is a close-up of the 1841 tithe map with a 13th century wall unbroken parallel to the street and signs of the former bank on the southern side of it. It clearly shows how important the street was, with few buildings between it and the beach. The latest Ordnance Survey map still shows the 13th century wall almost complete to the north of the street. There are still a number of the original boundary walls of the burgage plots leading up to the wall still surviving. As well as the 1564 survey, there are three other important lists of villages that have survived, which are shown here, and reveal a thriving village supporting a population estimated by KJ Penn and his historic towns in Dorset as being over 200. This was high when one considers that it was only reached 369 by 1801. The prominent family in all the list are the Limburys. In 1574, Edward Limbury purchased a number of properties, including the Elms, Manse and Charmouth House, the Fountain, from Sir John Peter. At the time of his death, he was receiving an annual rent of £40 a year, which leaves to his son Edward. John Mann appears on both the 1545 and 1542 rolls. Thanks to survival of the deeds of the Elms, owned by Charmouth Parish Council, we now know that he once occupied the property nearly 500 years ago. I've extracted the villagers from the previous list and placed them in alphabetical order. From these, it can be seen that the Limbury family were the most prominent and were classed as merchants in the 1588 list, contributing towards the charge of Queen Elizabeth ships. The 1545 list shows 35 heads of households, and the 1564 survey has 48 heads. This, with partners and children, would probably account for at least 40 houses and a population of over 200 in Elizabethan times. The protestation was an attempt to avert the English Civil War. In July 1641, Parliament passed a bill requiring those over the age of 18 to sign the protestation, an oath of allegiance to King Charles I. The list for Charmouth still survives with its signatures and is kept in the House of Parliament archives. It contains the original signatures of almost the entire male population of the village in that year. Although this is much later, it does provide an accurate list of the male population at that time, which had grown considerably from the reign of Elizabeth. No single owner of Charmouth had more impact on its history than Ford Abbey, whose abbots were to be its lords for nearly 350 years. The abbey had been founded in 1147 and in time was to become one of the richest and most learned institutions in England. By the end of the 13th century, they owned over 30,000 acres of land in Devon, Dorset and Somerset. It seems that land would be given to them on the understanding that they prayed for the souls of the donor. The Abbey of Ford had received a number of bequests of land in Charmouth from 1189, and by 1539, the year of its dissolution, had been lords of the manor for nearly 350 years. The village had prospered under them, especially with the last abbot, Thomas Chard, 1477 to 1544. He succeeded to the position in 1521, a position he was to hold for 18 years. He devoted great energy and vast sums on the improvement of their monastic buildings. He built an entirely new wing at Ford Abbey with carved panels, including his initials TC, as well as a new hall and lodgings for himself. The richly carved tower he constructed above the entrance still has a Latin inscription above the tall oriel window that reads, "Made in the year of our Lord 1528 by Thomas Chard, Abbot." He was to do likewise in Charmouth, where his cousin, Ralph Tibbs, that's his mother's surname, was steward, which still has his TC initials above the former entrance to the house. The lay subsidy of 1525 includes Ralph Tibbs revealed a population of about 200, it was shown to account for less than 10% of the total income of the abbey. Abbot Chard's master plan was interrupted in 1539 by the dissolution of the larger monasteries. He handed Ford Abbey quietly over to the crown, becoming vicar of Thorncombe until his death in 1543. Ralph Tibbs and his son Thomas were to become bailiffs and stewards of the manor of Charmouth, Toller and Turnmouth, with an annuity of £5 in the year 1535. They were no doubt to hold that role in the fine house Thomas was to have built for them. Ralph, with his son Edward, was later to appear on the 1542 muster roll list for the village possessing suits of armour. The survey taken by Sir William Peter, the new owner of the village, in 1564, refers to the Abbot's house as follows. William Bowdith holds by copy dated 22nd of July 1546 a message or cottage and 2 acres of land which are a curtilage and the common close for lives of himself and brother Robert, fine 40 shillings, rent 20 shillings. This is the finest house in the town and builded by the last abbot of Ford. This house granted to Roger Colwell and his children Nicholas and Rebecca by copy 28th 1561, fine £6. This provides some useful information as it shows the house with an acre of land and an acre of common land which corresponds with later estimates being rented by William Bowditch in 1546. It was later occupied by Roger Colwell in 1561, who appears in 1588 on the list of merchants, contributing towards the Queen's ships as paying the highest tax of 10 shillings and 8pence, the same as Edward Limbury. This is the year of his death, and in his will, which has survived, he is described as a clothier whose bequests include his wife, Alice, and children Nicholas and Rebecca. I feel confident that he held the position of steward for the village and acted as agent for Sir William Peter and collected the rents for him. This engraving by Carter Galpin from 1825 allows us to get an impression of how the Abbot's house may have looked at the time of Queen Elizabeth, with its original doorway in the centre and thick stone walls. This slide shows the original section before later extensions. The floor plan represents how the original layout of the interior with its solar, hall and kitchen. The majority of this has survived and been restored by the present owners. This slide helps us with a comparison of the early engraving of the Abbot's house and its layout today with the later additions. The interior today has been magnificently restored to reveal many of the original features of panelling and mullioned windows. Queen Elizabeth, in the 6th year of her reign, 1564, granted the lordship and manor to Robert and William Caldwell, gentlemen, and their heirs with all their rights, members, liberties, appurtenances, whatsoever to the late dissolved monastery of Ford in the county of Devon, belonging and all tenements, and also the adowson of the rectory and church of Charmouth, with their rights and all messages, mills, duff houses, fishing places. The Caldwells acted as agents for Sir William Peter, who paid just £25 for the entire village and its neighbour Newlands. This figure seems low, but there are many other examples to compare it with. Sir Giles Strangways bought Abbotsbury from the King with 2,000 acres of land for £1,096. Robert Henley paid £1,920 for 1,400 acres of Lyme Regis. Sir George Somers paid £1,000 for 1,000 acres in Upway. It would seem that if you had the money, you would pay just £1 to £2 an acre for land after the Reformation. Sir William Peter is shown as being one of the 4 members of a commission that was set up by Queen Elizabeth on June 24, 1564, to sell a number of rectories and adowsons and other properties to raise money, which included Charmouth. He must have taken advantage of his position and used the Caldwells, who were his neighbours in London, to act as agents for the purchase. A copy was later made of the original document, which is shown here. 1535, Henry VIII ordered his chief secretary, Thomas Cromwell, to put in train the process that was to lead to the dissolution of the monasteries. Cromwell's proctor or assistant, a young lawyer from Devon called William Peter, had the job of visiting the monastic houses of southern England to draw up a record of their possessions and to persuade them to surrender to the king. Sir William was immensely wealthy and used his position as Secretary of State for King Henry VIII, Edward, Queen Mary and Elizabeth to increase it with the dissolution of the monastic estates. He was known to have 36,000 acres in Devon alone. The house he had built, Ingatstone in Essex, is still home for his descendants. He died in 1572 and briefly his son Sir John Peter owned Charmouth. Altogether they were to be landlords for just 10 years, but there is a record of this time in the deeds to several houses in the village, which details Sir John giving 2,000-year leases on them. The family tree for the Peters detail that Sir William's daughter Dorothy married Nicholas Wadham of Branscombe in Devon, and with their combined wealth were able to build and endow Wadham College in Oxford, which still has statues of them above its gateway. Another branch of the Wadhams were to become lords of the Manor of Catherston, which adjoins Charmouth. In 1539, the total income for Ford Abbey was £373, and Charmouth accounted for £21 of this. Well, most of the Abbey estate was sold off soon after for £49 to Richard Pollard. Charmouth was to remain with the Crown until it was sold by Queen Elizabeth in 1564, with other villages to raise funds. Peter already owned many huge estates, and after paying just £25 was able to receive an annual income, according to a survey, of £27 a year. When Sir William died in 1572, his widow continued to reside at Ingatstone Hall, and so John and wife Mary Waldegrave, his sons, then resident at Riddle Park, looked for another property to suit their status. In 1574, John added West Thornton Hall and a further 12,000 acres to the family estate, which became the principal seat of the family. He was to finance the purchase by selling off a number of estates, including Charmouth. Both the present-day elms and limes on the street have deeds that show in 1575 they belonged to Sir John Peter. He was to sell properties off piecemeal, with the bulk, including Newlands, being bought by his close friend Sir William Pole in 1576. Among the many estates that Sir William Peter owned was that of Chute, shown in this slide just outside Axminster in Devon, and about 7 miles from Charmouth. William Pole purchased Chute House for £300 in 1560 from Sir William Peter. Later in 1575 he was to have further dealings with his son when he purchased the Manor of Charmouth. He had possessions throughout many parts of the neighbourhood: Kilmington, Musbury, Dowerwood, Colliford, Colliton and Seaton. He died at Chute in 1587 in his 73rd year and was buried in Colliton Church. His eldest son, only 26 years of age at the time, erected a remarkable monument to him there. He was to sell Newlands, which once formed part of Charmouth, to William Wadham of Catherston in 1590. There are a number of magnificent memorials to them in their chapel at Colliton. One of the most famous lords of the Manor of Charmouth was Sir William Pole, who meticulously recorded the history of Devon and its illustrious families, but it was not to be published until 200 years later by an ancestor prince to illumine his own work, The Worthies of Devon. Educated at Exeter College, Oxford, coincidentally the same as the Peters, he was a member of the Inner Temple in London, where he resided at times. He went on to be Justice of the Peace in Exeter and later on Sheriff. He married Mary Perham and was to have 11 children, depicted on her elaborate tomb in Colliton. In 1300, William Abbott of Ford required each burgess of Charmouth to have his own corn ground at his mill. It would have been very important for the village in the time of Queen Elizabeth and was described as a grist mill with 30 acres around it, which was leased to Joan, widow of John Payne, from Sir William Peter. It was John, son of William, who was to sell the manor to Sir William Pole, whose descendants sold the manor to William Elliston, but retained the mill lands until they disposed of them to Robert Knight in 1789. This photo from 1890 gives us an idea of the area around the mill before it's transformed into Manor Farm Holiday Centre in recent times. This plan is my interpretation of how the village may have appeared in 1564. I've attempted to add buildings and features to the tithe map which would have existed in Tudor Charmouth. Many properties are much older than they appear as they have been refaced, such as the Abbotts house, the Elms and Manor house opposite the church. There have been at least 3 inns, the Fountain, Rose and Crown, as well as the George, which is still operating. A weekly market was held in front of the church. The area between the bank and the sea was common land divided into half-an-acre plots, some of which still exist. Many of the houses are listed today, and this is helped where early construction has occurred and been recorded. Thomas Child was to spend a fortune improving the village with his cousin Ralph Tibbs as its steward and living in its finest house, now the Abbotts house. It was during this time as abbot that the church was improved and upgraded according to Hutchins. Both the George and the Fountain in now Charmouth House have contemporary features from his time. There is a fine fireplace and roof at the manor which had formerly been the grange for the abbey. I will now highlight some of the buildings that have survived from the 16th century, although in most cases much altered. The majority of the villagers would have had to settle for houses with thick cob walls, wattle and daub interior walls, with thatched roofs. The Abbott house and the church would have stood out with their fine stone walls. There was an estimated 40 properties along the street at that time, mainly on the north side. The majority had combined 2 of the original half-acre burgage plots and a further acre of common land. They would have paid a nominal rent to the abbot and later Sir William Peter. Their new landlords from 1564. The majority of villagers would eke out a living from the cattle and crops that grew on it. This photo from 1870, looking up the street to the church, shows the ancient Abbot's house on the left and George on the right, both of which stood in 1564. The heritage listing for the George Inn confirms it as a 16th century roof and a number of other historic features, and would have been one of the properties built for Thomas Child as an inn before 1539, when he poured money into the village to improve it. It's difficult to pinpoint the George Inn precisely in the 1564 survey, although I feel confident it was leased by a member of the Limbury family who were prominent at that time and appear on the early records of the Fountain Inn, the other hostelry at the top of the village. Another old photo from 1880 looking down the street to the old bridge. The building shown in the centre formerly stood on the site of Swiss Cottage / Redblood. It was originally an inn known as the Rose and Crown. The deeds to the property are now held at the Somerset Record Office and go back to 1561, when John Tye of Plumtree in Devon sold it to William Balcombe of Wootton Fitzpaine, that it stood between the tenements owned by John Wadham, Esquire of Catherston, and that of Honor Balcombe, all of whose names are listed in the 1564 survey. Many of the buildings shown here would have dated back to Tudor times, although altered over the centuries. The building on the corner of the junction of the street and Bars Lane was actually called Streets, and with its neighbours would have dated back to the 16th century. There were large gaps on either side which were not built on until the 20th century. This Victorian photograph helps us visualise how it once looked with its thatched roofs. It's difficult to recognise this view, taken in 90, looking down the street. The ivy-clad building on the left formed a shop that was later built on the side of a little lodge. It's since been demolished and is now a space for car parking. The deeds to Little Lodge go back to when it was known as Yandover. It's this house that is referred to in 1564 as being occupied by the widow Joan Limbury. There was a hayloft and 16 acres of land with it. This early photograph from 1890 looking down the street is one of the few that show the old manor house on the left opposite the church. In 1564 it was called the Grange and was leased from Sir William Peter by Joan Balcombe. At that time it had 51 acres of land around it. A later 18th century survey for the manor lands corresponds to the description of the fields. Ford Abbey had a number of granges in Dorset, including Lee and Broadway. A similar one existed for Abbotsbury and Abbotts Wootton, which still exist, and is known today as Upper Wootton Grange. The manor house today, which has been split into three sections, the heritage listing for the building points to the 16th century with its roof construction under the present roof and an open fireplace with moulded stone jambs and Tudor arched head with recessed spandrels. It would definitely have been built on Abbot Chard's time before 1539. This photograph taken in 1860 shows the court in the distance. In 1297, there's a record of a guildhall where the manor courts would be held there under the auspices of the monks of Ford Abbey. In 1588, Anthony Tutchin may well have been living in the adjacent building. He is described as a merchant contributing to the largest amount for the Queen's ship for the village in that year. It was to be his grandson, Anthony Tutchin, who had made his fortune shipping in London, who in 1673 left the property and an acre of land as an almshouse for the Charmouth poor. This was later to be demolished and rebuilt on Lower Sea Lane. The farmhouse for Foxley Farm is seen here in 1870 on the left. The listing described it as 16th century based on the roof and other features. The 1564 survey refers to Agnes Limbury, now the wife of John James, renting a cottage and 16 acres, including 3 acres at Foxley Acre. There was eventually 60 acres of land stretching behind the farmhouse as far as the Old Lyme Hill. The wellhead stands on the south side at the top of the street with a frontage that dates back to the 1930s. Behind it is a much older building. The famous historian Reginald Pavey, who did so much in his life to record the village's history, was to live in this house from 1926 until 1973, who had the original deeds. And one of his notebooks listed them back to 1683, when it was owned by William Balston's widow. In the 1564 survey, there is a reference to the family. John Balston, dead, holds 1 burgage, and his son Anthony Balston was now the tenant, paying 6pence rent a year. This earlier house may still be incorporated into the property, whose original walls are very thick. The Balstons were an important family, and in 1575, Anne Balston's will lists a number of bequests to her family and friends. In 1642, William Balston appears on the protestation list of the village. It is this gentleman who, on death in 1671, provides us with a link to the original deeds. The photograph shows the older part of the house at the rear in 1888, when the Harrison shown here lived there. This astonishing early photograph clearly shows how rural Charmouth was in the past, with the barn and walls of the Foxley farm at the rear of the houses now known as Badger's and Foxley Cottage. Amongst the deeds to Charmouth House, now kept by the Charmouth History Society, is one that refers to John Peter in 1575 selling a block of land and buildings to Edward Limbury. It records all that messuage, cottage or tenement lying between a cottage then in the tenure of William Rocket on the west side of another cottage then in the tenure of William Best on the east side and the Queen's Highway on the north side. It consists of barns, stables, edifice, lands, meadows, pastures, commonways, paths, woods, underwoods, easements. There were 5 acres of land on the east side of Harsey Lane and a further 60 acres on the west side that would form the Foxley Farm with its farmhouse on the street mentioned earlier. In Tudor times it was an inn called the Fountain, after the spring that fed a small stream which still runs at the side of Harsey Lane. William Rocket and William Best both appear on the 1564 survey, and Edward Limbury on the 1588 survey as one of the wealthiest merchants. The Fountain Inn is shown on the right of this photograph from 1880 with its former iron railings. The ivy-clad elms shown here has the distinction of being the only house to retain its lease for 2,000 years, which was made between John Peter of Writtle and Richard Pears of Lyme on 27th of April 1575. 2 other houses had similar leases but have been lost. Richard Pears was a Lyme draper. The house in 1575 was known as Man's Tenement and was occupied by Thomas Mann. The lease described it as a cottage with 1 acre of land adjoining to the south side. Also another acre of land lying between the land of Thomas Jess on the north side and the land of William Webber on the south side, and common of pasture for a mare and a foal or 2 cows. A view of the garden at the rear of the elms, which clearly shows the original building John Mann lived in 1545 on the left before it was dramatically altered. He is listed on both the subsidy and muster rolls. There's a record from the year 1289 which relates to this event as follows. Notification by Robert Wickhampton, Bishop of Salisbury, that he has been informed by many trustworthy men that the secular chapel at Charmouth, built a long time ago near the sea, has been ruined by the battering of the sea and storms. He gives his authority and assent to the abbot and monks of Ford, the postulant patrons of the chapel, to move it to a more suitable site than the shore and build a chapel on their own land to the honour of the blessed apostle Matthew and all saints, in which they may provide clerics and secular priests to minister divine service. The church was rebuilt by the monks where the present church stands. William Hutchins in his History of Dorset refers to it being restored by Thomas Chard during his time as Abbot of Ford. The drawing shown here is the only illustration so far found of the earlier edifice that was demolished in 1835 and rebuilt with its new dedication to St Andrew. This photograph of 1910 shows Stoneborough Manor when it was a school. An earlier building stood on the site in Tudor times, surrounded by 150 acres of land, referred to as Newlands. The full cartulary has a number of references to it and its tenants. It shows in the mid-13th century Geoffrey Le Bonnet was leasing it from them, which includes a description of its boundaries. It appears in early maps as a distinct area to the east of Charmouth with its junction to the River Char. Although separate for the village, it was included in the land holdings of Charmouth. This is clearly shown when in 1564 both were bought by Sir William Peter and a survey of them was taken. It records that John Payne in 1561 held 180 acres of land in Newlands, which included 90 acres of common, 6 acres of meadow, and 73 acres of pasture, 1 acre of wood, and 10 acres of common. It also refers to William Limbury having 18 acres of land called Newlands. After the dissolution, Newlands reverted to the Crown, and in 1564 Queen Elizabeth sold Charmouth and the Dowson of Newland to Sir William Peter. His son John sold the manor to William Pole of Chute near Axminster in 1575, whose son the antiquarian Sir William Pole conveyed Newlands to William Wootton of Catherston in 1590, but 9 years later the family to sell it with the manor of Catherston to Sir John Jeffrey. Newland, after its separation from Charmouth by William Pole in 1575, was often advertised for sale, and here are some of these with a description of the house and fields in 1783. The 1841 tithe map shows Newlands under the parish of Whitchurch Canonicum, and the reference book that goes with it supplies the names of the different fields and their acreage. It still had an area of about 123 acres, almost the same as 1564. The owner was the Reverend Thomas Naylor, who was rector of St Peter's Church in Marylebone, London at that time. He was later to move to number 2 Hillside in Charmouth with his family. There'll be a half-hour break for refreshments, and in the second part of my talk I will cover the families that were to buy or inherit the adjoining estates of Lyme Regis, Wootton Fitzpaine, Catherston and Berne, shown on the map here.